I've produced 2 videos that tell of my dad's experiences in World War II. The short version tells his stories but limits discussion of the broader historical context, while the longer version spends more time putting Dad's stories in the context of where and when. I produced these videos over 20 years after Dad's death. Since I knew the 2 ships he sailed on, I was able to get the history of his movements and even find some video and pictures that enhanced his individual experiences. His stories come from 3 sources: a taped conversation he had with a cousin of mine, stories my Uncle George told me years ago, and finally a handwritten letter he drafted talking about Guadalcanal. I put this video together with the sole purpose of preserving not only my dad's stories, but his voice, which means a lot to me when I hear it. My hope is, should future generations ever become curious about their family tree, this video may be of interest to them. While producing this video, it dawned on me that my dad's experiences could be scenes from a war movie. He was on a ship that got torpedoed and sunk, killing almost half the crew. On another occasion, he had to bail out of his airplane and spend the night on a coral outcropping in shark-infested waters before swimming to an island where he was rescued by local islanders. On another occasion, his airplane was destroyed by an equipment malfunction while being hoisted back onto his ship. The ship was sailing to engage the enemy, so it didn't return to rescue my dad for several hours. He also landed his seaplane on Guadalcanal the day the Marines began their invasion. He must have been one of the first airplanes to land on Guadalcanal, since most of the airplanes supporting the invasion were carrier-based. And finally, during his last 2 battles, he witnessed the sinking of one of his sister ships and was again hit by a torpedo, but survived the attack and was able to limp home for repairs. It's hard to imagine what it must have been like floating around the Pacific for hours and hours, wondering if anyone will be able to find you. There were no radio beacons or life rafts, just you and your life jacket. His combat duty only lasted a year or so. It was cut short when he came down with malaria and sailed home on a hospital ship, which is a story in itself. My guess is the time he spent on coral reefs or floating around the ocean were contributing factors. My father, Perry Roberts, completed flight school on January 16, 1942, just over a month after the Japanese bombed Pearl Harbor. Immediately after graduation, he traveled to Iceland for duty on the USS Quincy. On January 25th, the Quincy left Iceland, headed for New York Naval Shipyard to be equipped for battle in the Pacific. While his ship was being equipped, Perry spent his time training with the Marines that he will ultimately support in the Pacific. He also took time off to marry my mother in Norfolk, Virginia on April 18, 1942. On June 5th, Quincy left New York, arriving in San Diego on June 19th. In early July, Quincy sails to the Solomon Islands in the Pacific, joining a naval task force in late July that will support the invasion of Guadalcanal. On August 5th, the Guadalcanal campaign commences. Quincy bombards suspected Japanese positions as Marines invade the island. Perry, in his Curtiss SOC aircraft, acts as a spotter to direct Quincy's guns on enemy targets. On August 9th, the Quincy is sunk during the Battle of Savo Island. Perry, along with other survivors, spends 10-plus hours in shark-infested waters until they are rescued. The Battle of Savo Island was one of the worst U.S. Navy defeats in World War II. Immediately after his ship is sunk, Perry returns to Alameda, California, awaiting assignment to a new ship.
But the Quincy went down, we picked up the Marines that had been down there training, and then we went up and put them ashore, and prior to putting them ashore, of course, we bombarded the island, and there was nothing there to bombard. There were no troops on the island. It was an unopposed landing.
What, was it torpedo got the Quincy?
I suspect several torpedoes. Not sure.
Probably from a submarine?
Not so fast, it had to be submarines.
Yeah.
Well, no, it wasn't submarines, it was Japanese destroyers and cruisers all carried torpedoes, so I think it was probably their cruisers that launched the torpedoes, or their surface ships anyway. I don't think there's any historical evidence that they had submarines in that, for those confined areas.
I guess it didn't take the ship long to sink.
Less than a half an hour is my recollection.
Oh.
So it had to be torpedoes and probably hit magazines.
Were you in the water very long?
I don't know, I blacked out, I don't remember. Still daylight, anyway, for 8 or 10 hours, I suppose.
Destroyer probably pick you up.
Oh, yeah. No, that destroyer came by during the night and had said, we've got you spotted, we'll be back, because they were still worried about submarines, I think.
Yeah.
Worried about the outcome. So they stuck to their word, they came back and picked us up a day.
After my dad died, my sister found a tablet containing a handwritten letter to the author of a book describing the sinking of the USS Quincy. It doesn't appear that Dad was contradicting anything in the book, but just passing on his personal story, as well as his high regard for the ship's captain, Samuel N. Moore. Dad's incomplete letter reads as follows. I was ordered to Iceland, where I reported for duty on the Quincy. In March 1942, Quincy went to the Navy Yard in New York to get radar installed. Then we went to NAS Norfolk. We had wheeled landing gear installed on our float planes and trained with Marine artillery units to spot their artillery fire. This involved correction in range and bearing to bring targets under fire. In June, we went through the Panama Canal and then to the South Pacific. Marines assigned to Guadalcanal invasion provided maps of Guadalcanal. My gunner radioman and I were both trained as spotters, but the Marines decided their own officers would do the spotting. My ship, the Quincy, along with Vincennes and Astoria, were assigned to Guadalcanal landing, along with the Australian cruiser Canberra. By mid-morning, the Marines had their artillery ashore and requested an aerial spotter, which was Quincy's responsibility. Shortly before launch time, I reported to Captain Moore on the bridge. He asked, "How much wind do you need over the catapult?" When I answered 5 knots was adequate, he said, "If you decide that you'd like more, just let me know and I'll give you as much as you want." What now may seem like a small thing sure meant a lot to a green pilot on his first mission. How could I not do my utmost best to fly a successful mission? I will never forget Captain Samuel N. Moore, commanding officer, USS Quincy. I will always feel privileged to have served under him. When the Marine Corps spotter, whose name I've forgotten, and I arrived over the landing area, everything seemed to be going well. Unloading was continuing while some Marines were enjoying a swim and probably their first good bath in weeks. The Marines' first salvo was fired at the mouth of a small river close to Henderson Field, the airport the Japanese had started to build. The Marine spotter asked me if plus 500 yards was enough correction in range. Since the theory was that the first spot should never be short to ensure you don't hit friendlies, I suggested a minimum of plus 1,000 yards. He accepted my guess and gave his artillery buddies a correction of plus 1,000 yards in range, no correction in deflection. The second salvo landed dead center on target, which proves something about beginner's luck. Since the Marines' artillery didn't need us anymore, I suggested we look around instead of going back to the Quincy immediately. We cruised along the coast. We observed an area cleared of underbrush and well trampled, with a Japanese flag flying from a tall pole. We couldn't detect any signs of life. There was lots of room amid the palms. It was probably an assembly area for workers who came over from Tulagi each day. My Marine spotter wanted to get the Jap flag for a souvenir, so I landed, a not so smart move. We discussed who would go and get the flag. I knew I couldn't go back without him, and he knew he couldn't get back without me, so we canceled the stupid maneuver and flew back to Quincy without the flag. Other pilots from the Quincy were assigned to anti-sub patrol during our stay. I'm not aware that pilots from the other two cruisers in our division did anything. However, it was evident to me that our carrier fighters were working over the Japanese bombers that had been sent to break up the landings. I believe one of our transports was hit by a bomber at Guadalcanal. The few bombers that I saw from the Quincy were obviously hugging the water and running for home. They made no attempt to bomb us. I also remember the evening before we were sunk. It was known that a force was headed our way and could arrive at approximately 2 a.m. Our executive officer and Tom Chisholm, one of our pilots, were discussing why we didn't fly out to find the convoy and attack them. The XO explained that our responsibility was to protect the transports. My dad never completed the letter, nor did he write about the sinking of the Quincy and the night spent in the water waiting for rescue. While searching for stock footage for Perry's World War II movies, I Googled the term USS St. Louis reunions. A video from a 2008 reunion popped up. That video, which follows this introduction, contains a brief interview with a catapult operator. He tells a story of an event so unique and consistent with Perry's story of a similar event that it leaves little doubt that the crewmen and Perry were on the St. Louis at the same time. Their stories.
Down in Espirito Santo one day, we had sent our planes out, a couple of them, I guess, and when they returned, one of them pulled up to the stern of the ship in Baker Recovery to be picked up, and the pilot had got the plane in position, and he wanted the guy in the rear to hook the plane with that strap onto the hook of the crane. There was no one in the rear seat. The guy was gone. Never found out what happened. He jumped or fell out. Anyway, he wasn't there.
Fred Silverthorne was flying on my wing, and he got vertigo. And I suddenly saw him go right up over right over like that. And so we immediately broke everything up, and finally he came back and joined me. So we canceled the operation and went back, and his radioman had bailed out, and part of the parachute was still hung up on the gun. So he'd apparently opened it too soon, or got ran into when he recovered. He finally got back. He got, I suppose he was staring at me to keep position, and got vertigo and just rolled right over you. And then he got his head on straight and recovered and was pulled up. In the meantime, the radioman, I guess, thought he was spinning in and bailed out. We never could find him. I remember searching for him. We thought it was a possibility that he might survive a parachute partially deflated.
This movie tells two versions of the story of Perry bailing out of his airplane. The first section is Perry's version of the story as told to Francis in February 1994. The second section is my memory of the story George told me in 1964. There's a small world component to George's story that has been etched in my mind for almost 60 years.
We're talking about bailing out. That's okay. We were in Espirito Santo, I know, because we used to go back there to refuel and reprovision after being up at Guadalcanal, and radar was so new that it wasn't really, people didn't know much about it, so we always practiced every chance we got. So, on that day, whatever date it was, I took off and was to fly out on a southwest heading for 10 or 15 miles back because pretend I was the intruder. And the ship was going to direct out another airplane, one of my friends. And the weather was kind of stinky, so I climbed up to altitude, got above the overcast. And no one ever came out. Apparently they never picked me up.
Oh.
And so I flew back and forth a few times. No one ever came up to intercept me. So decided to go home. And I started let down, heading towards the ship. And of course, this was all just strictly dead reckoning.
You did? Oh, sure.
Anything except flying a heading, and I didn't know what the winds were, of course. Sure. As I was letting down, the engine quit.
Oh, no.
And I checked, apparently had all kinds of fuel, but the engine couldn't get it started. And I knew that the hills around there were about 2,500, 3,000 feet high, so I thought my position was so unsure that I couldn't gamble on letting all the way down to the water.
Because you might have been over land, you mean?
I might have been over land. Yeah. So Hardin, who was my radioman gunner, said, "You go and I'll follow you." And he got out, I went out. About 30 seconds later, I was in the clear. If I'd have stayed with it about another 30 seconds, I could have landed.
Yeah.
And he was a pretty good swimmer. I wasn't doing very good. I don't know why that may rest because my arms raw. So I come go on, come on in, don't wait for me. So he got into the island, and I didn't quite make it that night. I got a little off course and wound up on just a small coral outcrop that was probably a half mile from the island. Sat there all night until I could see again. You know, tropical nights sometimes are pretty black. So ever since I've hated crabs. The next morning, an airplane comes flying by looking for me, and I had my life jacket and they didn't see me. And I flew right by them but didn't see me a couple of times. I found out afterwards they thought I'd crashed in the hills, and they were up there looking for me.
Oh.
Well, in the meantime, the radioman, natives got the radioman back to the ship. And I figured they'd given up looking for me, so I swam across to the island. I really don't remember much except they sewed up my flight suit, which was ripped on the coral. Cut my hands up, tried. So they got word somewhere or other to the ship, and they came over and got me by one of the seaplanes. But I don't know why they really how you can fly by a person out there like it, but it can happen.
Well, he was looking out the other side of the airplane.
Well, I got two people. One guy searched one side, one the other, but apparently they all looked in the same direction. That they were going to some specific area to search and weren't looking on the way. He flew right by me a couple of times.
They didn't have the old signal flares in those days.
Oh, heck, we had nothing in the way of emergency equipment.
No.
Life jacket was all they had. But I guess one of the things I did was tie the ripcord in my flight suit in case saved it. That's kind of funny.
Yeah.
Just something I did.
Yeah.
I still got it here.
Huh.
So that's the end of that story.
No, the next one.
Of course, when I went aboard ship and had to go see the captain, had to hear the whole story and what happened. And eventually there was what do you call it, a accident investigation. Everyone what's it like to bail out, and then they were bailed out of an airplane. The result was they assumed that the carburetor iced up and quit. But I don't know. Never will know, of course.
No, you never will know.
I did know that the airplane sunk. Anyway.
Yeah, they never found it.
I spent the summer of 1964 with my Uncle George, my dad's oldest brother. He told me the following story. It's a small world story that relates to the story you just listened to. George was 6 years older than my dad. When they were growing up on the farm, my Uncle George and his friend, let's just call him John, were riding on a horse-drawn water tanker when my dad fell off and was seriously injured. George and his friend rushed my dad to the local doctor. Fast forward to after World War II, my dad returns home and tells George this story. I had to bail out of my airplane once and had to swim to an island off in the horizon. I couldn't make it by nightfall, so I spent the night on a coral reef. I was exhausted and all cut up by the coral. I didn't think I would make it to the island, but I got a boost from the current and made it to the beach. I was in pretty bad shape, but some natives found me and took care of me until they could get word to the Marines that they had found a downed pilot. The story goes on to say that Dad caught malaria and was again in bad shape. When he was put on a hospital ship, a doctor making rounds looked at his dog tags and said, "My best friend George Roberts has a younger brother named Perry." When the doctor found out that my dad was George's brother, he said, "The last time I saw you, you were seriously injured, and now I see you again and you're seriously ill. I'm sure you'll recover, but we should both hope that I never see you again." In this movie, Perry tells Francis about the time a hoist malfunction caused Perry's airplane to be dropped into the water, where it is torn apart by the ship's prop wash. Perry and his radioman spend several hours at sea before his ship is able to reverse course and find them.
What happened the time that you get dropped in the drink, as they say?
Well, I guess you have to sort of understand the recovery procedure, I suppose.
Mm-hmm.
The ship is underway and how you get back aboard it.
Yeah.
And it's kind of a long, drawn-out explanation, but the ship would, depending on the situation, they would turn 45 degrees to the wind and then make a 90-degree turn across the wind. And then that made a slick that you could land in.
Oh, how about that?
It would smooth out the water quite a bit. And of course, they're still going at 15 or 20 knots. I don't know what the speed would be. It's roughly that. But then while they were doing this, they drug, what do you call the thing? A davit out over?
Yeah, I know what you mean.
With those big long poles.
Yeah, yeah. The same thing when you're coming aboard a ship, you get on.
Anyway, they had what's called a sled dragging from this thing.
Mm-hmm.
It was a rope, mesh rope. And the airplane had a hook on it that was spring-loaded.
Uh-huh.
Drive up on the sled, and then when you cut the engine, it would come back and hook a rope.
Yep.
So there it was on the same speed as the ship then. And I normally did, I suppose, radioman could do it. I could stand up in the cockpit and open up a compartment on top of the wing and take out a long cable, hook it onto the sling they'd drop a hook and you'd hook on the sling, then they'd lift you up. And as quick as they lifted you up, then the rope would drop loose. In this case, we got about, I don't know, 10 or 15 feet in the air, and something happened. The clutch on the hoist released, or somebody did something wrong, something broke, dropped the airplane into the water. Well, then we're being towed by the top of the airplane, so it just went cartwheels. And of course, the catapulter, that area is just about opposite the screws. So when we went into the water, we're tumbled by the propeller wash. It came up half a mile, quarter of a mile astern. And airplanes came up searching for us, and they couldn't find us. Another instance, they knew exactly where we were. All they had to do was backtrack on the ship's wake, and they couldn't find us. So I suppose an hour, maybe longer than that. And the task force command, they're not a task force, a task group or task unit, 3 cruisers, the admiral in charge reversed course and had all the gunnery optics searching. And this is how they found us. Their gunnery optics. And then the destroyer came over and picked us up. But the airplanes couldn't find us. Flew right over and then couldn't see us.
Was the airplane, I guess it's sunk then, right?
Well, I think they hoisted the board, but the wings were torn off in order to get rid of it. There's no way to release it.
Oh, sure.
The airplane was completely destroyed.
So you got thrown out of the airplane when this happened, I guess.
Well, quick as it flipped, we were gone, because I was standing up and it was unbuckled, when you land.
In a prior movie, the story of Perry's airplane being destroyed was told. Since he didn't have an airplane, he was assigned to the command tower of the St. Louis, where he monitored the ship's radar. He was monitoring radar in both the Battle of Kula Gulf and Kolombangaro, both of which occurred in early July 1943. Perry watched the USS Helena sink and disappear from radar in the Kula Gulf battle. In the Kolombangaro battle, the St. Louis was hit by a torpedo and returned to port for repairs after the battle. Upon returning to port, Perry catches malaria and boards a hospital ship bound for the U.S. World War II is over for him. The movie that follows has two parts. The first part is the battles explained by a naval historian. The second part is a discussion of the battles during Perry's conversation with Francis.
Following a brutal 6-month campaign that included a number of primarily cruiser-based battles, but which also included battleships and other large ships, the Allies have secured Guadalcanal at the southern end of the Solomon Islands. Rendova is where the Allies choose to make their next attack. In that area, the Japanese have a small airfield. They don't tend to base aircraft there, but it makes a good place for their aircraft to stop if they're damaged or if they need to refuel on the way to Guadalcanal or on the way back. So the Allies want to take this air base and deny that to the Japanese. When Halsey, who is in control of the Southwest Pacific area, learns that a Tokyo Express run is going to happen. So he orders those ships to turn around and go back out there to the Kula Gulf, where he expects these Tokyo Express destroyers to come. So the American force is led by Admiral Ainsworth, and it's 3 Brooklyn-class light cruisers: Honolulu, St. Louis, and Helena. They're also all equipped with radar by this point in the war, and they know how to use it. And these 3 light cruisers are being escorted by the destroyers Nicholas, O'Bannon, Radford, and Jenkins. So the Japanese force is coming down in the darkness. The American force picks them up on radar and starts firing with the fast-firing 6-inch guns of their light cruisers and the faster firing but lighter shells of the 5-inch armed destroyers. And this battle ends up taking just under a half hour for the main part of the action before both sides have suffered casualties and pretty much mutually break off the engagement. So the Japanese are caught a little bit flat-footed and do what they do when they're caught flat-footed, which is to say they launch a spread of torpedoes, and the American ships are able to land several hits on Niizuki, the flagship, the lead ship of the column, and they manage to sink her outright with gunfire. And they kill Akiyama in so doing. Meanwhile, the light cruiser Helena has been, because she had done shore bombardment, she used all of her flashless powder. So during this engagement, she's using smokeless powder, which doesn't obscure rangefinders during daytime, optical rangefinders, but it does flash. So at night, this ship, firing 6-inch guns, over a dozen rounds per minute, per barrel, is really lit up. So the Japanese can see her better than any of the other ships, and she takes a torpedo hit and is sunk. And all of the American casualties for the battle come off of Helena. None of the other ships are hit. This one takes place just after our last battle of Kula Gulf. This takes place at Kolombangaro. The American fleet comes in, and they're all equipped with radar at this point, so they are ready for night fighting, and at a range of approximately 20 miles, which is a pretty good maximum range for their surface search sets operating inside of an island group, they're able to pick up the Japanese fleet. And this is a huge turnaround from the earlier fighting around Guadalcanal, where some of the American ships had radar, some didn't. They didn't know how to use it, or when they did know how to use it, they didn't quite trust it. No, the Americans, they could see the Japanese at 20 miles, and they were ready to spring a trap. The Japanese were not, in fact, caught off guard. And because the Japanese torpedoes were far better and had a much better range than their American counterparts, they were able to launch their torpedoes first. So the Japanese launched their torpedoes, the Americans launched their torpedoes second. All three of the American cruisers ended up taking significant damage. Leander was hit by shell fire and a torpedo, and she basically wouldn't be repaired in time to participate in the war anymore. Honolulu and St. Louis both had to go back to the United States for permanent repairs.
There were three ships. We were the tail end ship because it was the junior captain was the last man alive. The Admiral was on the Honolulu, was the lead ship. Helena was next, and we were third. And I never forget, we used to argue about it. The Helena always went to rapid fire, and you could see that ship like it was sunlight was shining, just like broad daylight when it went to rapid fire. And the other two ships always set fire to sideways, so they were dark periods. And I never could figure out why. I know our gunnery officer was really ticked off about he didn't like that gunnery officer. I don't know why the Admiral didn't lay down the rules, but he didn't. He was captain on his own ship.
Why would we go to rapid fire?
I don't know.
Were they shooting?
Was it been down there, and they had been through a couple other scraps with the Japs, so...
Were there Japanese airplanes flying then?
Oh no, this was at night. We'd go south. The Japanese were on their run at that time, but they were trying to come back with troops any way they could by small destroyers, barges, anything to bring them down on the islands.
What were you firing at?
Japanese ships that were bringing down...
Other ships. Okay.
Anyway, we'd go up there night after night. We'd go get up there about midnight and run like hell to get away from air cover. Air cover the next day. And this night, I think this is the last. Anyway, what we would normally do was escort the ships up and fly back to Guadalcanal and spend the night, and then they'd come back and we'd go aboard again. They didn't want to keep the airplane, didn't want to waste time recovering, so we'd fly back. At night, you're no good anyway.
Right.
But occasionally, this one ship I somehow or other designated to plot the action. We had radar in the captain's cabin or his duty station. He had radar, and the radar man was in there plotting. And the Helena disappeared.
Off the radar screen?
Well, you keep station.
Sure.
Helena disappeared and couldn't figure what happened. And then finally, a destroyer had something on radar, couldn't identify it, and the destroyer lit it up and it was the bow of the Helena. And she took several torpedoes and sunk very rapidly. And shortly thereafter, we got the bow blown up. And the Honolulu got hit. So all three of us had commission and just like that. But during this, the hatch came off and knocked me on the can. Get some hate. And you say, we're making history and you're supposed to be recording it. Well, that woke me up right away. It wasn't the regular hit, it was just from the guns firing. One cell when the hatch came loose. Didn't hurt, it just knocked it down. Calm and gentle, just calm as could be. He didn't call me Mr. Roberts either, so he didn't call me young man, said, making history, and I want you to make sure you record it. So then I went back to port, and I wound up with malaria, and wound up the end of the war for me.
Did you go back to the States then? Or?
Yeah, I went to Maryland Hospital and Alameda.
Well, you had a nurse waiting to take care of you, I guess.
But I was, I was sort of banned from going back to the South Pacific. They said you'd come down with malaria again, so you couldn't go down there.
Yeah.
Finally, when I got, well, they had carried a class 3 or something. Couldn't fly combat aircraft. That's garbage.
That's all, folks.